Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we are concluding the Big Four series by taking a look at South Africa. Let's go. So before we kick off, if you've enjoyed the series, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps the algorithm and all that good stuff, and share with a friend also as well. If you're new and this is the first video you're checking out, I'd highly recommend looking at the previous 3 videos in which we look at the Big Four in Africa. So the countries that have received the most startup investment, that is Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. Today's videos will be about South Africa. So just want to get all of that housekeeping out of the way. But now let's kick off. Okay, so today's overview is pretty much the same. We are going to be doing a quick overview. Then we're going to look at the investment landscape, considering strengths and then issues. And then we're going to look into a capital markets analysis, a quick overview of both the public markets and the private markets. And then finally, going to conclude with just a future outlook. So pretty much the standard, but let's go. Okay, so looking at South Africa with a quick overview. South Africa has a population of 61.2 million people. I think this is recent estimates from last year, 2022, and 66.7% of that population resides in urban areas. I think that's an important point to make, considering kind of like how we look at how developed kind of the public markets are, and a lot of the companies on the public markets, what they service for. So that's South Africa from a population standpoint. I'm just going to throw on a map. So this is the map of South Africa and its neighboring countries. So you can see South Africa is bordered by Namibia to the northwest, by Botswana and Zimbabwe to the north, by Mozambique and Swaziland to the northeast and east. And Lesotho is an independent country which is an enclave in the eastern part of the republic, entirely surrounded by South African territory. And then South Africa's coastlines border the Indian Ocean to the southeast and the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest. So South Africa, obviously in relation to the other countries I mentioned in the Big Four series, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt, also boasts of a large reserve of rich mineral resources. So kind of like the main, as we know from South Africa, has been gold and diamonds, but South Africa is rich in a variety of other resources such as iron ore, platinum, manganese, chromium, copper, uranium, silver, and titanium. While it differs from Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt in that it has no commercially, or at least has not found any commercially exploitable forms of petroleum, there are some moderate quantities of natural gas which are located on the southern coast, and synthetic fuel is made from coal at 2 large plants in the provinces of Free State and Mpumalanga. So if we take a look at some of the issues impacting South Africa, there's 2 main ones that I'd like to kind of like just draw to our attention. To be fair, there's 2. There's electricity shortages, and then there's kind of like insufficient high quality infrastructure provision. I think on the first one, the electricity shortages are probably the most pressing bottleneck for economic activity in South Africa. And over the last decade or so, or the last, let's say 15 years, there's kind of been a worsening in kind of like the power supply that's been taking place in South Africa. And obviously you can imagine how that can impact businesses and how that can impact obviously individuals from a personal perspective, but also kind of like with businesses, enterprises, organizations, that then impacts their opportunity to kind of like, you know, continue working, continue kind of like meeting their capital requirements, continue just organizing themselves in South Africa. And a lot of the things, sometimes what happens is sometimes South African organizations might look to kind of like as a strategic objective to maybe push out and further into Africa. So kind of like addressing that electricity provision will not only kind of like increase and kind of like help out economic activity, but also encourage the firms that are kind of like present in South Africa to continue investing, you know, allocate their capital towards South Africa as opposed strategically elsewhere. And then the second would be an insufficient provision of high quality infrastructure. And this can range from, you know, railways to roads to telecommunications. So I think infrastructure is kind of the backbone of any economy, and kind of like it is a pressing issue to make sure that you invest more in it so that it provides individuals and businesses the opportunity to continue to grow and to develop. That is probably the 2 most pressing issues that we see with South Africa, which is a similar theme that we've seen with other nations in the Big Four, particularly Nigeria. That relation, there is probably a much more closer similarity between South Africa and Nigeria. I must say that South Africa is probably more advanced from an electricity perspective, just in kind of like taking into account the totality of electricity provision in South Africa in comparison to Nigeria. So improving the provision of high quality infrastructure, I think will probably be a public investment conversation, but obviously you'll see that that would help strengthen not just only large infrastructure projects that will take place, but also kind of like will provide businesses the confidence and investors the confidence that South Africa is a place to invest their money from an FDI perspective. So obviously from those 2 points, improving kind of like electricity generation and also electricity kind of like networking, whilst also improving kind of like the high or providing more high quality infrastructure will be probably the two most pressing issues that will help to provide kind of like productivity growth in South Africa. South Africa, South Africa, South Africa. Pull up in Soweto, downtown Soweto, pull up. Let's go, let's go, let's go. My piano, they carry me, they go. Okay, so let's take a look at now the capital markets analysis. We'll start with the public market and then move over into the private markets. So taking a look at the private markets, we have here the largest South African companies by market capitalization. So as of February 2023, we have Naspers that has a market capitalization of $40.54 billion. And then second, you have First Rand that has a market cap of $21.68 billion. And then Standard Bank Group and then MTN Group. Then you have Vodacom, Capitec Bank. So we can see Naspers is a internet tech and media holding company. They also, part of their subsidiaries also forms Prosus, which is a global consumer internet group. And they are also kind of like technology investors. And then you have Takealot, which is South Africa's largest e-commerce retailer. And then Media24, which is Africa's leading media group, which also has this kind of like a special presence in both digital and traditional publishing and publications. So I think interestingly, obviously Vodacom, I think from obviously First Rand, Standard Bank, Capitec Bank, it's also very finance heavy. You have Goldfields later on kind of like in number 9, which obviously makes up kind of like the more kind of like gold industry that we mentioned before in South Africa. So it's relatively diverse kind of like companies from market capitalization, which is always quite interesting. MTN Group is one that you hear a lot as well. I think we also mentioned it in the Nigeria video as well. So that is the public markets, and now let's take a look at the private markets. So just kind of like throwing on the screen here, this is the total funding raised by South African tech startups by year. You see kind of like an enormous increase from 2020 to 2021. This is just the overall graph. But interestingly, although more South African ventures are receiving, investing and backing this year, from the 2021 total up 9.9%, on 2020, the country's overall proportion of funded startups compared to the rest of the continent is actually on the decline. So a large proportion of, increased investment attention is actually going to elsewhere on the continent. So in 2021, South Africa was home to 15.7% of African startups to receive funding. But in 2020, this figure was 20.4%. And in 2019, it was 25.4%. So as we're seeing kind of like, especially with Egypt, as we mentioned in the last video, we're seeing kind of like other regions and other kind of like hubs in Africa becoming more popular, which is also kind of like spreading out the demand for kind of like interest in African startups. And that is impacting the South African kind of like startup scene. South Africa largely for the last few years actually ranked kind of second or third in terms of kind of like the region or the country that was receiving the most startup funding, and now it's fourth. So just looking kind of like, obviously this information again is 2021 because that's the most accurate and reliable information that we have for your reference. But in total, 39 South African ventures raised over $1 million US threshold. This was up significantly on the 26 plus rounds that were raised in 2020 and 2019. However, in 2020, South Africa's tally of 26 was the highest number on the continent. So it was actually the highest in 2020. But in 2021, Nigeria and Egypt both outstripped South Africa with 55 and 43 of the $1 million US rounds. And Kenya is also kind of growing and has kind of, as we've seen, has also kind of surpassed at the time. So see, this is just kind of the information of, investor demand is kind of like spreading out to different regions in Africa, and different countries are benefiting from that. So in 2021, the 3 standout investments was the fintech Yoco, which bagged an impressive kind of $83 million in its round. eHealth venture LifeQ, which secured $47 million, and the fintech Planet 42, which raised $30 million. So if we look here in 2021, we can see kind of, this is just South African startup funding. So 61.2%, amazing, a very, very large amount, went towards fintech, and then kind of like the rest was spread out. Obviously 18.5 went to e-health, which is very interesting. 9.8% went to other, 4.4% transport, 3.2% edtech, and then 2.8% went to AI. Obviously we can see that the fintech kind of like ecosystem or industry outstripped any other kind of like tech sector for private market investment. So South Africa actually has a large and very influential local investor base, and obviously a lot of kind of their startup investments is funded and fueled by their kind of like local startup base. International investors are also kind of participating, but we've seen largely recently that they are looking to participate in kind of like other countries, you know, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt. While we've seen the missing middle, which is evident in other parts of kind of like the big four, and particularly I think we saw it in Egypt, but that's a relatively early and growing ecosystem. The fact that you have very high amounts of raises in your pre-series A, your seed, your series A, and not necessarily kind of like, you're not seeing the developments or the kind of high kind of like number of startups that are going through, you know, series B, series C, series D. This isn't actually the case in South Africa. So South Africa is relatively a lot more developed, and the country's ecosystem is more mature than elsewhere. So we don't see that kind of missing middle. And there is a higher prevalence of series A level back in than elsewhere. So for example, of 39 rounds where the stage of investment was to close, 41% was series A, and then a further 10.3% were pre-series A, as opposed to kind of like in other regions where we're seeing kind of like high levels of, you know, pre-seed and seed raises. So it's really good for the ecosystem that there's a mature kind of like pipeline, which gives the confidence for both local investors and institutional investors that they can see kind of like further rounds of growth and further rounds of maturity. Okay, so that's kind of like the private markets and the public markets done. So that's our capital markets analysis. And yeah, just from a future outlook perspective, I think there's two main points. I think I've got my notes here, so please just let me kind of like make sure that I'm saying the right things. So I see two things that would be helpful for South Africa from a future outlook perspective, and one is the acceleration of the green transition, and the second is making the tax system more progressive, which would ultimately benefit kind of like obviously tax revenue, but also kind of like society from an income inequality standpoint. And so first, with the accelerating the green transition, that would help to increase in the share of renewable energy that's taking place. So this would also help support both the growth through investment, but also kind of reduce the electricity shortages, which we mentioned before in terms of was an issue for kind of like the investment landscape in South Africa. We've seen kind of like an early introduction with the carbon tax that was introduced in 2019, which is welcome in the country that where coal remains kind of like the main energy source, but the level definitely needs to be gradually increased and exemptions reduced so that it does encourage not only organizations and businesses, but also kind of like administrations to participate and accelerate this green transition. And then in parallel with economic activity, also kind of like helping to make the tax system more progressive, which would obviously be helpful and efficient at raising the revenues generated from taxes, but also could help to reduce the budget deficit, which would then then allow the South African Treasury to then finance investments, particularly into the high quality infrastructure that we mentioned before. I know that the South African government are also looking to solve for inflation. So once inflation has been abated, they can then look to kind of like provide transfers to low-income households, kind of like helping to improve the wealth inequality that is prevailing in South Africa. Ultimate economic activity and the productivity in South Africa would be increased, providing them with more of an opportunity to invest and partake in the South African economy. Also, improving the tax system to make it more progressive would be helpful. So tax system could definitely be made more progressive, which would also be efficient at raising the revenue rates that are generated from taxes, and also helping to reduce the budget deficit, which can then obviously with that surplus you can then use to finance investments into the country, into the high quality infrastructure that is definitely needed in South Africa, and would ultimately provide more of an advantageous situation to the South African economy. And then obviously I know the government is trying to solve for inflation, but once that is abated, there is room to raise the relatively low VAT rate, and then you can balance that with increased transfers to low-income households, which will ultimately help to improve the wealth inequality that is prevalent in South Africa. So that is the Big Four series concluded. I hope it was enjoyable. I hope you had fun. I found it fun. I found it fun doing the research and just like reading up about these things. So I hope kind of like if it was of interest, feel free to comment, like, subscribe. Also tune into my newsletter where I kind of like go into depth into some of these topics and some of these ideas. Share with a friend, and hopefully I'll see you back for the next video. I'm still planning what I'm going to do, what I'm going to think about it. But if you have any suggestions, let me know. I'm more than happy to have a think about that. And on that note, peace.